Hey there, boys and girls. Today we're going to be reviewing those 3 pages of notes that we did last week on the cells. This is not something where you have to write anything down. You're just going to listen and watch. But I'm going over these notes with you for a couple reasons. Number one, it was a lot of information. There's a lot of vocabulary words to remember, and you do have a quiz on it this Thursday. And then number two, we had a number of students that were absent when I taught this lesson last week. We have some students that are absent today. And so it'll benefit everyone to rewatch this full lesson. And I've added some animation and extra pictures that will help you better understand it. And I'm going to close out today with a song that will help you remember it. So let's go ahead and celebrate the cell today by going through these notes. And by the way, you have to appreciate the fact that, yes, my earrings are actually plant and animal cells today. So I'm celebrating the cell with you. So let's take a look. The first page of notes was just an overview of cells, what they are and what they do. And then page 2 of your notes was about animal cells, like human skin cells. And then page 3 of your notes was a review of plant cells that have some additional parts to it, like these root cells. So let's take a look at our first page of notes and just get a definition of what a cell is. So a cell is what every living thing is made out of. Every single thing that God created that is alive is made up of these little tiny cells. And for the most part, they are too small to see with your eyes alone. Usually you have to use a microscope to study them. And so hopefully if it works out in our schedule, we will get a chance to pull out microscopes this week and look at some actual cells through microscopes. If we don't, then we'll look at them when we come back from break. For the most part, those cells, you do need a microscope to study them. There is an exception to that. Eggs are actually cells. And the largest cell then in the world is the largest egg, which is an ostrich egg. But for the most part, they are what we call microscopic. Now, cells are the building blocks of life. And a good way to think about that is to think about Legos. So Legos come in all different shapes and all different sizes to them. But if you put them together, you can make more complicated structures, whether you look at simple structures like this, or you get into more complicated structures that have lots of pieces to them. All of them, though, are made out of these basic building blocks. And so that's the same thing in how God created everything that is alive. You can have very simple organisms that are just made up of one single cell. We would call those unicellular. Uni means one, like this little paramecium here, who's microscopic and lives in water. Or if you put some more cells together, you can get larger organisms that you can see with your own eyes, like this mushroom. This is what that mushroom looks like under a microscope. So you can see it's made out of lots of different cells, and some of them are different shapes from others. Or you can get increasingly more complicated. So here is the world's tallest Lego tower, and here is the world's largest living thing, and both of those are made out of the same stuff, these individual little building blocks, which can come in different shapes. But if you have lots of them and you have a complicated support system, then you can build something that's really impressive, like this is my husband's X-Wing Star Wars Lego creation. But the idea is that they all are made out of these really simple, small things, and you just put a whole lot of them together and you get something really complex. So again, organisms can be unicellular, which means made of only one cell. Things like bacteria, and we'll study protists and yeast. Those are made out of only one cell. And then we also have more complicated stuff that's multicellular, that's made out of lots of different cells. Now, when we talk about Legos, though, as building blocks, really, a Lego isn't actually that complicated. I mean, really, they aren't. They're pretty simple. But cells themselves are actually incredibly complicated. And those cells, every single cell is helping that organism, that living thing, to survive. So inside of every cell, there are all these parts, and those parts are working together to help the bigger organisms to be able to survive. Those things that the organisms do to survive are called life processes. And you can define these in different ways, but I picked 5 life processes for us to look at. And as we study in science in January and February about all the different living things and all the categories that humans have made to try to categorize and classify all those living things, we'll see that whether we're talking about something really, really tiny or something really, really big, all of them are going through these same 5 processes, and they do it in different ways, but they do all 5 of these processes to survive. So the first one is that they have to get energy in some way. They can be a plant that does photosynthesis to get energy from the sun to make its own food, or it could be something like an herbivore that eats plants, or a carnivore or omnivore that's eating another organism, but all of them have to get energy in some way. And then once they've gotten that energy, then they need to use that energy. And they use that for everything that they need to do to survive, from growing to moving around. They're going to use up the energy that they've gotten. Another important life process is to be able to reproduce, to make more of their own kind. So after that one organism dies off, is it going to be the last of its kind, or are there going to be more of them? If there's going to be more of that species, then that organism has to be able to reproduce in some way. And it can be a really simple reproduction process, like this little cell splitting in half to make 2 cells, or it can be something very complicated in its reproductive process. So a seed that sprouts into a new plant, and chick that is hatching from an egg, or what mammals do, which is live birth. All of those are different ways that God has given them to be able to reproduce, to make more of their own kind. Another thing that all living things do is they respond to their environment in some way. So here we have a little microscopic creature called an amoeba, and it's responding to its environment by eating this other little microscopic creature called a paramecium. So it's acting and moving around. Even plants actually respond to their environment, like this plant growing towards the light. Or the predator-prey relationship is another way that organisms are responding to their environment. So organisms are moving away from things that are going to hurt them and moving towards things that are going to help them to survive. And everything that's alive does that in some way or form. And the last one that all living things need to do is to get rid of waste. And obviously humans, we know how we get rid of waste in a bathroom, but there are some other creative ways, like this owl right here has eaten a mouse and it's expelling out the bones of that mouse and its fur that it can't eat in an owl pellet. Or this is a little sea sponge, and after it's eaten its little microscopic creatures, then it squirts out a mucus out of its opening. It doesn't have a mouth, but it's opening to get rid of its waste. So those are the 5 processes that all organisms do. And in every single living thing, every single one of those cells is going to be doing those 5 processes and helping the organism to survive. So let's take a look at how that works for a plant cell and an animal cell. Plant cells have more parts to them that we're going to study. So we'll take a look at those in a separate page of notes. But let's start with our animal cells. So first of all, animal cells have a spherical shape, a round shape like a ball, or they can be irregular shape. So this is our like nerve cells or bone cells or smooth muscle cells. Sometimes they have kind of blobby shapes to them, but in general, they're going to be more round for animal cells. The different parts of an animal cell, we'll start with the cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm is basically what fills up the cell. So it's a jelly-like substance that fills the whole cell and everything else floats in it. And God made it jelly-like for a reason. It has like kind of a liquid property to it that allows all the stuff that's floating in the cell to be able to move around. But it also has more of a solid to it so that it holds it together and it keeps its shape. On the outside of the cell is what's called a cell membrane. And so this is just the outside of it, but it's actually incredibly complicated. So it actually has 2 different layers to it, and there is a whole lot of fancy chemistry and biology that goes into understanding what goes in and out of the cell. But the cell membrane basically acts like a gate. So it says helpful things like water and food can come into the cell, and bad things like bacteria that's causing infections are going to stay out of the cell. And the cell membrane, basically with a combination of biology and chemistry, decides what gets to go in and out of the cell. Next, we have the nucleus of the cell, and the nucleus is the command center of the cell. It is what tells all the other parts of the cell what to do. And the nucleus itself has its own separate membrane in an animal cell. If you look in a microscope, and we just like the microscopes that we have at school, you can actually see the nucleus. Some of the other parts are a little too small for us to see with a regular microscope. You have to have a more expensive one. But a regular nucleus you can see with a regular microscope as that little dot. It's not always right in the middle, but it is pretty big and it's pretty noticeable. And inside the nucleus, this is kind of mind-blowing here. Inside of a nucleus, there are 46 in a human cell nucleus, 46 chromosomes. These little guys here, and each one of those chromosomes has these little tiny these molecules in them called DNA, which are these big long strains of basically computer programming that tells every cell what it needs to do in your body. So the DNA is what makes you you. Half of it comes from your mom, half of it comes from your dad, and every single cell in your body has this DNA in it. And that's the programming that tells your body whether or not, what color colors you're going to have, what color hair you're going to have. All of those things are found in your DNA. It is actually incredibly complicated. It has taken scientists years and years to try to understand DNA, and they still don't completely understand a whole lot of it. But it's basically like computer programming that tells every cell in your body exactly what it needs to do to help you to survive and to make you you and unique and different from everything around you. Next, as we said, one of our life processes is that after we get energy, we have to be able to use the energy. And so in our cells, there are these little guys called mitochondria. If you've got a bunch of them, we call them mitochondria with an IA. That's the plural of them. And usually we have lots of them in a cell. So we usually talk about them as mitochondria. If you only have one of them, you're talking about just one of them, it's called a mitochondrion. O-N is the singular form of them. And they are the power plant of the cell. So your food goes into these little mitochondria, and then they literally burn the food, chemically burn it to release energy. And that's how your body uses and gets, it's how your body gets that energy from its food, is in the mitochondria. As we mentioned, another thing that all cells do is they need to get rid of waste. And so these guys here are called vacuoles. And the vacuoles are basically the storage bins for that waste. So before your body is ready to get rid of the waste, it puts these in the little tiny vacuoles. They can also store food, and they can also store water that's waiting to be used. And so for animal cells, those vacuoles are going to be small, and they're going to have a lot of them. So that's our 5 parts we need to know for an animal cell. Now let's take a look at our plant cell. Our plant cells have those same 5 parts, but then they also have some other parts that we need to know as well. So we're going to look at 2 more parts that are specific to plant cells that animals do not have. So first of all, plant cells are rectangular in shape, shaped more in a rectangle, as you can see from our model here, or from this picture of a cell under the microscope. And then if you look at this digital image, you can see that there's kind of this special stiff structure on the outside of it. That is what we call the cell wall. That's something that an animal or a plant cell has that an animal cell does not, the cell wall. And it's basically a thick, stiff wall that supports it and protects the cell. So if you look at a piece of cork under a microscope, that's a good way to see the cell wall. Cork is a kind of plant that's dried up. And if you look at it on a microscopic level, you'll see all of those cell walls that are left behind. Those cell walls are actually what allows plants to grow so tall. So since they don't have bones, they need something else to support them. So in the same way that Legos are stiff and thick, and that's what allows them to be able to stack on top of one another and build something because they're rectangular in shape. That's the same thing that is the idea with each of these cells. They have that thick, stiff cell wall that allows them to be able to build up nice and tall. And that's how we get things like trees that are so tall without bones. Now, inside the cell wall, they have a cell membrane just like our animal cells. So the cell wall is on the outside, and then there's still that cell membrane on the inside. And the cell membrane is thin, and sometimes it's kind of hard to see because it's on the inside of that cell wall. But just like in an animal cell, it does act like a gate that lets stuff in and out. Then also, just like an animal cell, we have the cytoplasm that fills up the inside of the cell. Cytoplasm, which fills up the inside of the cell. That's the jelly-like substance that everything else floats in. Then you also have your vacuoles, which are your storage bins for waste, water, and food. There is a difference here, though. With an animal cell, we had a lot of little small vacuoles. With a plant cell, we have 1 or 2 large vacuoles. And the reason for that is that those vacuoles are actually going to hold that water, and that pressure from the water is part of what supports the cell. So if you look in this video, if a plant starts to lose too much water, that causes the cells themselves to start shrinking in, and that's actually what causes a plant to start to wilt. So the reason why plant cells have just 1 or 2 large vacuoles is that having all that water stored in the vacuole creates this extra pressure, and it's kind of like a balloon. If it stays fully inflated, that's part of what provides the plant with the support that it needs. And if it doesn't get enough water, then those vacuoles start to shrink, the cell itself shrinks, and that's actually what causes it to start to wilt. Now, just like an animal cell, plant cells also have the nucleus as the command center, telling all the other parts what to do. It does include those chromosomes that have DNA in them. And for a plant, that DNA is the programming that tells it what color it's going to have for its seed and its pod, and what the seed's going to look like, what color the flowers are going to be, how the flowers are going to be positioned on the plant. All of that is determined by that nucleus, by the DNA that's in that nucleus of each one of them. Now, another part of a plant cell that is different than an animal cell is these little guys here, chloroplast. And the chloroplasts have they kind of look like mitochondria, but they have little spots to them instead. And the chloroplasts are where the plant is going to make its own food using energy from the sun. So the chloroplast is the food factory of the cell. It contains this chemical called chlorophyll. That's what gives it its green color. And that's what allows it to trap the energy from the sun. So the chlorophyll are actually moving around inside the cell, and they are all trying to get the sunlight. And then they take that sunlight and they turn that into energy. So this is zooming in here on a chloroplast, and the chemical inside is called chlorophyll. That's what's trapping the energy from the sun, and then it's making its own food in these little pancake-like structures inside. And we'll get into more detail later about how it does that process. It's pretty complicated, but that's what's happening in every one of those chloroplasts. And then once the food is made in the chloroplast, then it goes to the mitochondria. And just like in the animal cell, those mitochondria are the mighty mitochondria that make the food for the plant. Okay, that was a lot of information. So I'm going to go ahead and review it for you with a cheesy Miss Davis song that goes through those parts. And so I'll sing it for you one time. It does have like an echo part to it. So when we actually sing it live, I'll have us divide up, and half of us ask the question and half of us sing the answer. But I'll just go through it one time for you so you can hear it and get all of this information in your brain. Hey there, animal cell, what lets things out and in? My cell membrane is my gate, it acts like a skin. Hey there, animal cell, how do you get energy? Mighty mitochondria are my food-burning factory. Hey there, animal cell, tell me who drives this bus? My boss that controls it all is my nucleus. Hey there, animal cell, what fills up your inside? My jelly cytoplasm is where my organelles reside. Hey there, animal cell, tell me what is your shape? Usually I'm spherical, kind of like a grape. And now plant cells. Hey there, plant cells, tell me, are you just the same? I've got those parts that you just said, but there's more to name. Hey there, plant cells, tell me how trees get so tall. Outside our cell membranes is our rigid cell walls. Hey there, plant cells, what gives you that green cast? It's the chlorophyll that makes our food and our many chloroplasts. Hey there, plant cells, how do you store waste and food? It's our 1 or 2 large vacuoles that are the storage tubes. Hey there, plant cells, tell me, what is your shape? We're long and rectangular like a thick piece of tape. All right, that's a lot of information to learn. Your quiz is on Thursday. We'll keep reviewing for it. Good job today.